Sometimes, it only takes two cruel words to reveal who truly understands justice. On a cool Monday morning in downtown Washington, District of Columbia, the marble lobby of the Federal Justice Center buzzed with quiet conversations, polished shoes clicking across spotless floors, and the soft echo of elevators opening and closing. Attorneys hurried toward courtrooms carrying leather briefcases. Federal employees scanned identification badges before disappearing behind secured doors. Uniformed officers greeted familiar faces with practiced professionalism. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, at least until an unexpected voice cut through the calm. "She does not belong here." The words were not shouted, but they landed heavily enough that several nearby conversations stopped in mid-sentence. A few people instinctively glanced toward the reception desk where a 36-year-old black woman stood holding a neatly organized folder against her chest. Angela Brooks wore an elegant navy business suit, low heels, and a silver watch that had clearly been chosen for practicality rather than luxury. Her posture remained straight despite the uncomfortable attention now surrounding her. She had arrived nearly 20 minutes early for a scheduled meeting with federal investigators, carrying documents that she believed could finally help resolve a months-long financial fraud investigation affecting dozens of working families. Instead of being welcomed, she found herself standing silently, while an impatient security contractor frowned at her identification card as though searching for a reason to question her presence. Several people nearby lowered their voices. Others simply watched without saying anything. Angela had experienced moments like this before. Years of community leadership had taught her that assumptions often entered a room long before facts did. She slowly inhaled, refusing to allow frustration to replace dignity. Just a few yards away, a young white detective stepped through the revolving entrance carrying a slim case file beneath his arm. Detective Ethan Walker had only recently joined the Federal Major Crimes Task Force after earning a reputation for patience, careful observation, and an unusual ability to notice details most people ignored. At 28 years old, he looked younger than many expected, something that often caused strangers to underestimate him before learning about his accomplishments. He quietly adjusted the collar of his dark suit jacket, the small leather badge holder remaining hidden inside his coat pocket. His assignment that morning involved meeting with investigators on the 6th floor regarding evidence connected to an interstate fraud network. But before reaching the elevators, the unusual silence spreading across the lobby caught his attention. Ethan slowed his pace without attracting notice. Rather than immediately asking questions, he watched. Years of investigative training had taught him that the first few seconds of any situation often revealed more than the next 30 minutes of explanations. His eyes moved calmly from the security desk to Angela, then toward the surrounding crowd. He noticed uncomfortable expressions, hesitant body language, and one employee quietly looking away instead of speaking. Then the second remark arrived, spoken with enough confidence that everyone nearby heard it clearly. "People like you always have the wrong building." For just a heartbeat, the entire lobby seemed frozen. Angela did not answer. She simply held her folder a little closer and maintained steady eye contact, refusing to surrender her composure. Ethan felt the atmosphere change instantly. This was no longer simply a misunderstanding about visitor credentials. Something far more important had just revealed itself. Without saying a single word, the young detective took one slow step forward, his attention fixed not on the cruel words themselves, but on every face that had chosen either to speak them or remain silent after hearing them. None of the people standing in that bright federal lobby realized that within the next few moments, one small badge marked with the number 417 would quietly change everything. Detective Ethan Walker remained completely still as the uncomfortable silence settled across the federal lobby. Around him, polished marble reflected the bright morning, sunlight streaming through towering glass windows. Yet the warmth outside never reached the expressions gathered around the reception desk. Angela Brooks stood exactly where she had been moments earlier, neither raising her voice nor lowering her eyes. She simply waited, holding her leather folder with quiet confidence, as though she understood that dignity often required greater strength than anger. Ethan studied every detail before deciding to move. The security contractor who had questioned Angela's presence, a middle-aged man named Richard Hale, leaned casually against the reception counter while continuing to examine her visitor confirmation with unnecessary suspicion. His body language suggested certainty rather than curiosity. Behind him, the receptionist looked increasingly uncomfortable but remained silent. Two attorneys exchanged uncertain glances before pretending to check messages on their phones. A federal employee carrying coffee paused near the elevators, obviously aware that something inappropriate had just occurred, but equally unsure whether speaking would make matters worse. Ethan recognized the familiar pattern immediately. Investigations had taught him that people often revealed themselves most clearly during moments when they believed nobody important was watching. He walked forward at an unhurried pace, careful not to interrupt the situation too quickly. Experience had shown him that patience frequently uncovered truths that confrontation could accidentally hide. As he approached, Richard glanced toward him with only brief interest before returning his attention to Angela. "Ma'am," he said in a practiced but noticeably colder tone, "this building has strict security procedures. Maybe you should double-check your appointment before wasting everyone's time." Angela calmly reached into her folder and removed a neatly printed confirmation letter. "My meeting is scheduled for 9 o'clock with special investigations on the 6th floor," she replied politely. "I arrived early because I was asked to bring additional financial records." Richard barely looked at the document before sliding it back across the counter. "These federal offices are busy. Every day, mistakes happen." Angela nodded once. "That is exactly why I brought every document requested." Her voice remained steady, measured, and respectful. Ethan noticed something else that few people would have recognized. Angela never argued about herself. She spoke only about facts. That alone told him far more than any emotional reaction could have. Quiet confidence often belonged to people who understood exactly why they were there. Richard folded his arms. "I still think there has been some confusion." Ethan finally stepped close enough to hear every word without drawing unnecessary attention. He did not identify himself. He did not interrupt. Instead, he observed the identification resting on the counter. The visitor authorization displayed Angela Brooks's name, the correct meeting location, today's date, and a verification code already approved by federal scheduling staff. Everything appeared perfectly legitimate. Ethan's eyes then shifted toward the security monitor beside the reception desk. The electronic visitor system displayed the same approval in bright green letters. There had never been a problem with Angela's appointment. The problem existed somewhere else entirely. Richard seemed unaware that Ethan had already noticed the discrepancy. "We have to be careful these days," Richard continued, offering what sounded more like an excuse than an explanation. Ethan quietly asked his first question since entering the lobby. "What exactly are you being careful about?" Richard turned toward the young detective with mild irritation, apparently assuming he was another visitor waiting in line. "Just making certain people belong where they say they belong." Ethan glanced briefly toward Angela before returning his attention to Richard. Based on which information? Richard hesitated for the first time. The question was simple, yet it demanded an honest answer. Around them, several people who had remained silent moments earlier now watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Angela said nothing. She simply waited, her calm expression unchanged. Ethan slipped one hand inside his suit jacket, not with sudden movement, but with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew exactly what came next. Hidden inside the leather holder resting against his chest was the one piece of identification that would soon reveal why everyone in that lobby had been paying attention to the wrong person. Detective Ethan Walker kept his hand inside his suit jacket for another brief moment, allowing the silence to settle naturally across the lobby. Years of investigative work had taught him that truth often carried far greater weight when it arrived without unnecessary drama. Richard Hale folded his arms more tightly, still convinced he was in complete control of the situation. Several visitors waiting near the security checkpoint quietly shifted their attention toward the young man standing beside Angela Brooks. The receptionist lowered her eyes toward the computer monitor, sensing that something important was about to happen. Angela remained calm, her expression unchanged. She had come prepared to discuss financial evidence, not to defend her right to stand inside a federal building. Ethan finally removed the small leather badge holder from inside his jacket. He opened it slowly, revealing a polished federal detective shield beside his official credentials. Just beneath the shield, engraved clearly into the metal, appeared one simple number. Badge 417. Richard's confident posture disappeared almost instantly. His shoulders straightened as recognition replaced certainty. The receptionist looked from the badge to Ethan's identification before quickly checking the visitor authorization system again. Nearby conversations stopped completely. Even the security gate seemed unusually quiet, as everyone instinctively focused on the unexpected development unfolding only a few feet away. Ethan spoke in the same calm voice he had used since entering the building. Detective Ethan Walker, Federal Major Crimes Task Force. He closed the badge holder, but kept it visible. Now I would like to understand exactly why a visitor with valid authorization has been delayed. Richard blinked several times before answering. Detective, I was only trying to follow security procedures. Ethan nodded politely. That is exactly what I would expect. He glanced toward the visitor confirmation still resting on the counter. Please explain which procedure required ignoring an approved federal authorization displayed in your own system. Richard looked toward the computer monitor, but found no answer waiting there. The electronic record still displayed Angela Brooks as fully approved for entry, complete with today's date, meeting location, and verification number. The receptionist quietly cleared her throat. The authorization has been active since early this morning, she admitted softly. Ethan turned his attention back toward Richard. Then the authorization was never the concern. The statement hung quietly in the air. No accusation followed it. None was necessary. Everyone standing nearby had already reached the same conclusion. Angela watched the exchange without satisfaction or anger. She simply remained patient, understanding that facts were finally speaking louder than assumptions. Ethan then looked directly at Angela for the first time since revealing his credentials. Ms. Brooks, may I see your appointment letter again? She immediately handed him the neatly organized document. Ethan reviewed it carefully before comparing it with the electronic visitor record displayed on the monitor. Every detail matched perfectly. He handed the letter back with a reassuring smile. Everything appears completely correct. Angela accepted the folder with quiet gratitude. Thank you, Detective. Ethan turned once more toward Richard, though his tone remained respectful throughout. Federal facilities depend on careful judgment. Security is essential, but so is accuracy. Every visitor deserves to be evaluated by verified information rather than personal assumptions. Richard lowered his eyes for several seconds before speaking. I understand. Ethan did not raise his voice or prolong the moment. Instead, he simply asked the receptionist to print a visitor badge for Angela. Within moments, the printer beside the reception desk produced the official pass that should have been issued from the beginning. The receptionist handed it across the counter with an apologetic smile. Angela accepted it graciously before attaching it neatly to her jacket. As the elevator doors quietly opened across the lobby, several federal employees who had witnessed the entire exchange exchanged thoughtful glances. The atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody seemed interested in the cruel remarks spoken only minutes earlier. Instead, every eye now rested on the quiet professionalism of the young detective whose small badge marked with the number 417 had transformed not only the conversation, but the conscience of an entire room. The elevator doors remained open, waiting quietly as though the building itself had paused to witness what had just happened. Angela Brooks thanked the receptionist with a courteous smile before taking a slow step toward the polished stainless steel doors, but Detective Ethan Walker remained beside the reception desk for another moment. His attention was no longer focused on Richard Hale alone. Instead, he looked around the spacious federal lobby, noticing how quickly a single act of fairness had changed the atmosphere. The whispers had disappeared. People who had looked away only minutes earlier now watched with thoughtful expressions, perhaps asking themselves silent questions they had never considered before. Ethan believed those moments mattered. Investigations often solved crimes, but character was revealed in ordinary decisions made long before anyone expected accountability. Richard cleared his throat quietly. Detective Walker, he said with visible sincerity, I owe Ms. Brooks an apology. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Angela, allowing the decision to remain entirely hers. She turned back from the elevator without hesitation. Richard stepped away from the reception counter and stood before her respectfully. Ms. Brooks, I made assumptions without relying on the facts that were right in front of me. I spoke to you unfairly, and I delayed your meeting for reasons that had nothing to do with official procedure. I am genuinely sorry." The lobby remained silent as everyone waited for Angela's response. She studied Richard's expression for several seconds before answering in the same calm voice she had maintained since entering the building. "I accept your apology. I only hope the next person who walks through these doors receives the welcome they deserve before anyone decides who they are." Her words were gentle, yet they carried enough weight that even those standing several yards away seemed to reflect upon them. Ethan recognized something remarkable in that moment. Angela had been given an opportunity to embarrass someone publicly, yet she had chosen something much more difficult. She had chosen dignity over satisfaction. Richard lowered his head slightly. "You have my word that I will remember today." Ethan finally spoke. "Remembering is important. Changing is even more important." Richard nodded without offering another excuse. The receptionist quietly printed a second document and handed it toward Ethan. "Detective, Special Investigations called a few minutes ago. They said Ms. Brooks is expected in conference room 6 immediately upon arrival." Ethan glanced at the notice before smiling toward Angela. "It appears they have been waiting for you." Angela gave a small laugh, the first relaxed expression she had shown all morning. "Then I suppose I should stop keeping them waiting." As they walked together toward the elevator, one of the attorneys who had witnessed the exchange stepped forward. "Ms. Brooks," he said respectfully, "I should have spoken up earlier. I am sorry that I remained silent." Angela smiled kindly. "Speaking now is still better than remaining silent forever." The attorney nodded thoughtfully, clearly carrying those words with him as he returned to his office. The elevator doors closed softly, carrying Ethan and Angela toward the 6th floor. Inside the elevator, neither spoke for several moments. The quiet hum of the machinery filled the space while floor numbers slowly illuminated above the door. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You remained remarkably composed." Angela smiled faintly. "My father always reminded me that losing composure rarely helps people discover the truth." Ethan looked at her with genuine respect. "He sounds like a wise man." Angela nodded. "He believed character becomes visible when circumstances become difficult." Ethan could not disagree. As the elevator reached the 6th floor, the doors opened onto a secure federal hallway where several investigators already waited outside a conference room. One senior investigator noticed Angela immediately and walked forward with obvious relief. "Ms. Brooks," he said warmly, extending his hand, "we have been looking forward to meeting you. The documents you are bringing may finally help us understand who has been hiding behind this fraud network for nearly a year." Ethan exchanged a brief glance with Angela. Neither of them realized that the evidence resting quietly inside her leather folder was about to uncover a case far larger than anyone inside that federal building had imagined. Conference Room 6 reflected the quiet precision of every federal investigation conducted within its walls. A long walnut table stretched across the center of the room beneath bright recessed lighting, while large digital displays covered one wall beside neatly organized evidence boards filled with timelines, financial charts, and photographs connected to an investigation that had frustrated authorities for nearly 11 months. Senior Special Investigator Laura Mitchell stood as Angela Brooks entered, immediately extending both hands in greeting. "Ms. Brooks, thank you for coming," she said warmly. "We appreciate you making time for us." Angela returned the greeting with a calm smile before carefully placing her leather portfolio on the conference table. Detective Ethan Walker remained near the doorway, observing quietly while several analysts and investigators settled into their seats. He recognized the focused expressions around the room. These were people who had spent months following scattered financial records that refused to connect into a complete picture. Laura looked toward Ethan. "Detective Walker, I understand you happened to witness an unfortunate delay downstairs." Ethan answered simply, "The matter has been addressed. Ms. Brooks is here now, and I believe today's discussion is far more important." Laura nodded with appreciation before turning her full attention toward Angela. "Everything we have learned suggests you discovered unusual financial transfers while volunteering with a neighborhood housing assistance organization. Is that correct?" Angela gently opened her portfolio and removed several carefully organized folders, each labeled with dates, transaction summaries, and supporting documentation. "I was reviewing annual community grant reports when I noticed that several approved payments never reached the families listed in the records," she explained. At first I believed it was an accounting mistake, but the same pattern appeared again and again across multiple counties. An analyst immediately leaned forward. How many transactions are we discussing? Angela slid a spreadsheet across the table. More than 300 documented transfers over approximately 14 months. The room became noticeably quieter. Laura reviewed the first page before slowly looking back toward Angela. These account numbers are different from the ones we have been tracking. Angela nodded. Because the money never followed the official reporting system. Someone created secondary accounts that looked legitimate on paper, but redirected small amounts from dozens of grants. Individually, the differences appeared insignificant. Together, they represent millions of dollars intended for working families. Ethan watched as investigators exchanged astonished glances. For nearly a year, specialists had searched for a major theft. Angela had discovered that the entire operation depended upon hundreds of tiny irregularities hidden beneath ordinary paperwork. Laura turned toward one of the forensic accountants seated nearby. Can you verify these routing numbers against our database? The analyst began typing immediately. Within less than a minute, several highlighted matches appeared across the large digital display. They connect, he said quietly. Not only do they connect, they explain every gap we have failed to reconcile since the investigation began. Laura slowly placed both hands on the conference table, absorbing the significance of what she had just seen. Ms. Brooks, do you realize what you have done? Angela smiled modestly. I only brought the records that seemed important. Laura shook her head with genuine admiration. You brought the missing foundation of an entire federal case. Ethan glanced toward the evidence board, where disconnected timelines suddenly began making sense. One document after another fit naturally into place because someone outside law enforcement had refused to ignore details everyone else considered too small to matter. Angela never displayed pride. She simply answered each question with careful accuracy, explaining how patient record-keeping and concern for struggling families had led her to continue searching long after others might have stopped. Ethan found himself respecting her even more than before. Earlier that morning, she had demonstrated remarkable dignity in the face of unfair treatment. Now she was demonstrating extraordinary integrity through careful preparation and quiet determination. As another analyst projected newly connected financial pathways across the digital display, Laura looked around the conference room and spoke words that immediately changed the direction of the entire investigation. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have finally identified where this case truly begins, and we owe that breakthrough entirely to Ms. Angela Brooks. The conference room remained silent for several seconds after Senior Special Investigator Laura Mitchell acknowledged Angela Brooks's contribution. No one rushed to speak because every person present understood the significance of the discovery unfolding before them. Across the large digital display, financial pathways that had appeared unrelated only minutes earlier now connected into one coherent pattern. Small transfers that once seemed insignificant formed a carefully concealed network stretching across multiple states. Detective Ethan Walker quietly studied the screen while forensic accountants continued verifying account numbers against federal databases. One confirmation after another appeared in green beside the transaction records Angela had brought. There was no excitement in the room, only quiet determination. Experienced investigators understood that meaningful breakthroughs demanded careful verification before celebration. Laura looked toward one of the senior financial analysts. Run a complete comparison against every grant distribution from the last 18 months. The analyst nodded immediately and began entering additional search parameters. Within moments, dozens of new matches appeared. Another investigator leaned forward. Every one of these transactions follows the same sequence. Small amounts disappear before reaching the approved recipients, then move through temporary holding accounts before being consolidated elsewhere. Laura folded her arms thoughtfully. Someone believed these individual amounts would never attract attention. Angela answered softly. That was exactly why I kept reading every report. The numbers never felt random. Ethan looked toward her with growing respect. Most people stop searching once the differences appear too small to matter. Angela smiled gently. Families do not consider missing assistance insignificant. Even a few $100s can determine whether someone pays rent or keeps the electricity on. Her words settled over the room with quiet impact. Every investigator understood they were no longer examining abstract financial records. Behind every missing transaction stood real people whose lives had been affected by decisions made far beyond their control. Laura turned toward the evidence board and carefully removed several outdated timeline cards before replacing them with new information supported by Angela's records. The investigation finally possessed a reliable foundation. Detective Walker stepped closer to the display, noticing one account number appearing repeatedly across separate counties. This routing sequence continues appearing at regular intervals, he observed. The forensic accountant immediately enlarged the records on the screen. You are right. Every transfer eventually touches this same administrative account before disappearing. Laura nodded slowly. Then we are no longer searching for scattered activity. We are looking at a centralized operation. The room became energized, but not chaotic. Investigators quietly accepted new assignments. Analysts divided financial records into review groups, and legal specialists began preparing requests for additional documentation. Every movement reflected discipline built through years of federal service. Angela watched the coordinated activity with quiet satisfaction, never seeking recognition for herself. She had simply wanted someone to listen carefully enough to the evidence. Laura approached her once more. Ms. Brooks, your attention to detail has likely saved this investigation. Angela shook her head respectfully. The investigators are the ones doing the difficult work. I only noticed something that did not seem right. Ethan smiled. Many important investigations begin because one honest person decides not to ignore an uncomfortable question. Laura agreed. And today that decision may help protect countless families in the future. A few minutes later, an administrative assistant entered the conference room carrying fresh coffee and updated briefing packets. She quietly placed one beside Angela before saying, "Thank you for helping us." The simple gesture reflected how completely the atmosphere had changed since that morning. Only an hour earlier, Angela had been questioned despite possessing valid authorization. Now experienced federal professionals recognized her as the person whose careful preparation had transformed an investigation that had stalled for nearly a year. Ethan noticed the contrast, but said nothing. He believed genuine respect required no dramatic speeches once people chose to see the truth clearly. As the meeting continued, a secure notification appeared across the digital display indicating that additional banking records had just been approved for immediate review. Laura looked toward the screen before turning back to the team with renewed confidence. The evidence is opening doors much faster than we expected. Let us follow every fact wherever it leads. Ethan quietly looked toward Angela once again, realizing that the most valuable evidence inside the building had never been hidden inside a vault. It had arrived that morning in the hands of a woman whose character had proven far stronger than anyone's first impression. As the meeting moved into the next stage, the atmosphere inside Conference Room 6 shifted from discovery to disciplined action. Large digital displays continued updating with verified financial records while investigators quietly organized new assignments around the evidence Angela Brooks had provided. Detective Ethan Walker stood near the center of the room, studying the growing network of account connections that now stretched across multiple states. Every new document confirmed the same conclusion. The fraud had never depended upon one dramatic transaction. It had succeeded because hundreds of ordinary records appeared too insignificant for anyone to question individually. Ethan understood that the strongest investigations were often built by people willing to notice what others overlooked. Senior Special Investigator Laura Mitchell walked toward the evidence board with a marker in her hand and drew a new timeline connecting every confirmed transfer. "We now have the beginning," she said calmly. "What we need next is the decision-maker behind these accounts." One analyst enlarged another series of financial reports on the screen. Most of these transfers were approved within minutes of each other, but they originated from different regional offices. Laura nodded thoughtfully, which tells us someone coordinated everything from a central location. Angela quietly reviewed one of the spreadsheets still resting in front of her before raising a single finger. "May I point out something else?" Every investigator turned toward her immediately. Laura smiled. "Please do." Angela slid another document across the table. These approvals almost always happened on Monday mornings between 8:30 and 9:15 Eastern Time. The forensic accountant quickly compared the timestamps. Seconds later, He looked up with visible surprise. She's right. Nearly every questionable transaction falls within the same 45-minute window. Ethan leaned closer to the display. That suggests a routine rather than random activity. Laura circled the time period on the digital board. Excellent observation. Whoever controlled these transfers preferred consistency, because consistency attracts less attention than sudden changes. Angela gently shook her head. Actually, consistency attracted my attention. Several people around the table smiled quietly. Ethan appreciated how naturally she viewed patterns that experienced investigators had spent months trying to identify. She possessed no investigative badge, yet her patience had revealed what technology alone could not. Laura turned toward Ethan. Detective Walker, I would like you to coordinate with our financial crimes unit. I believe these new timelines may finally justify expanding the investigation. Ethan nodded immediately. I will begin with the regional authorization records and employee access logs. Laura agreed. Focus on documented facts only. We are building a case that must stand entirely on evidence. Ethan appreciated those instructions. Throughout his career, he had learned that assumptions created problems, while verified information created justice. As the team continued reviewing documents, a secure message appeared on the conference room monitor indicating that additional banking institutions had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators following the newly verified financial pathways. The room filled with renewed energy. Analysts began comparing records from multiple databases, while legal specialists prepared formal requests for supporting documentation. No one celebrated. Everyone simply worked with greater confidence because the investigation finally had clear direction. Angela quietly gathered a few remaining papers inside her portfolio, believing her role had largely concluded. Ethan noticed her organizing the documents. Are those your original notes? He asked. She nodded. Every observation I made before contacting federal investigators. Some pages probably contain ideas that turned out to be incorrect, but I kept everything. Ethan smiled. Never underestimate careful notes. Sometimes the smallest observation explains the largest mystery. Laura overheard the conversation and added, If you are willing, we would like to preserve copies of your original records as part of the official investigative file. Angela agreed without hesitation. Of course, I only want the truth to be complete. Laura accepted the notebooks respectfully, almost as though receiving valuable historical records rather than ordinary handwritten pages. As Ethan watched the exchange, he reflected on everything that had happened since entering the federal building earlier that morning. A woman who had been questioned despite valid authorization had become the most trusted voice inside the investigation. It was another quiet reminder that truth never depends upon first impressions. It depends upon the courage to keep looking until the facts speak for themselves, and everyone in that conference room had finally begun listening. The investigation gathered momentum with remarkable precision as the afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows overlooking downtown Washington. Inside Conference Room 6, the atmosphere remained calm, but noticeably different from only a few hours earlier. The uncertainty that had defined the case for nearly a year had been replaced by careful confidence. Every investigator now worked from the same verified foundation, and much of that foundation had come from the patient observations recorded inside Angela Brooks's handwritten notebooks. Detective Ethan Walker sat beside one of the forensic analysts reviewing newly released banking records that had arrived through secure federal channels only minutes before. Thousands of transactions flowed across multiple computer screens, each one automatically compared against the timeline Angela had identified earlier that morning. Suddenly, one analyst paused. Detective Walker, there is something unusual here. Ethan rolled his chair closer to the monitor. What did you find? The analyst enlarged a sequence of transfers that had occurred during 3 consecutive Mondays. These transactions followed the same schedule, but one approval was delayed by exactly 17 minutes. Ethan studied the timestamps carefully before turning toward Angela. Did anything unusual happen during that week? Angela thought quietly for several moments before opening one of her original notebooks. She slowly turned several pages until she found a handwritten note made months earlier. Yes, she replied. That Monday, there was a regional banking software update. Several community organizations mentioned temporary processing delays. The forensic accountant immediately compared the federal records with archived banking maintenance reports. Less than a minute later, he looked up with obvious excitement. The software update interrupted the transfer sequence. Whoever controlled these transactions had to repeat one approval manually. Laura Mitchell stepped beside the monitor. Manual approvals leave stronger audit records than automated ones. Another analyst searched the corresponding access logs. Within seconds, a new file appeared on the large digital display. Instead of anonymous routing information, one administrative employee identification number appeared beside the repeated authorization. The room grew noticeably quieter. Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully. For the first time, we have a verified point where a real person directly interacted with the transaction. Laura nodded carefully. One verified record is far more valuable than 100 assumptions. Angela watched the screen with quiet satisfaction, never interrupting the investigators as they continued comparing documentation. She had never hoped to solve the case herself. Her goal had always been much simpler. She wanted someone to notice what she had noticed. Ethan glanced toward her. Your notes about that software update seemed insignificant at first. Angela smiled softly. I almost did not write them down. My father always believed ordinary details become important when enough time passes. Ethan returned the smile. He was absolutely right. Across the conference room, another analyst raised his hand. The employee identification number appears again 6 months later during another manual correction. Laura immediately approached the display. Can you confirm it? The analyst carefully compared both records before answering. The same identification number, the same administrative permissions, the same authorization window. Laura looked around the room. Now we have a documented pattern supported by independent records. No one celebrated. Experienced investigators understood that every new discovery required careful verification before drawing conclusions. Ethan quietly appreciated the discipline surrounding him. The investigation was advancing because every person in the room respected facts more than speculation. Angela gathered another stack of supporting documents from her portfolio. There is one additional file you may find helpful, she said. These are letters from several families whose assistance payments arrived late. I organized them by date rather than by county because the timing seemed more important than the location. Laura accepted the folder with genuine appreciation. That organization may save us weeks of additional work. Ethan looked around the conference room once more. Earlier that morning, Angela Brooks had entered the building carrying a folder that some people never bothered to examine before judging her. Now every investigator treated every page she offered with careful attention because they had learned that truth often arrives quietly, carried not by status or appearance, but by someone willing to keep careful records and refuse to overlook the smallest detail. The quiet rhythm of focused work continued throughout the afternoon as conference room 6 gradually transformed from a place of unanswered questions into a command center built upon verified evidence and patient collaboration. Rows of digital displays now presented organized timelines instead of disconnected financial records, and every newly confirmed document strengthened the same conclusion. The investigation was no longer searching for scattered irregularities. It was steadily uncovering a coordinated system that had remained hidden because too many people had accepted incomplete information as complete truth. Detective Ethan Walker carefully reviewed another collection of banking authorizations, while Senior Special Investigator Laura Mitchell coordinated updates with financial analysts in neighboring offices through secure video conferences. Every department now worked from the same evidence package, and every conversation reflected growing confidence without abandoning professional caution. Angela Brooks remained seated near the end of the conference table, quietly reviewing her original notebooks one final time before preparing to leave. She believed she had already contributed everything she could, but Ethan had learned that thoughtful observers often remembered important details only after the larger picture became visible. He walked toward her carrying one of the updated financial summaries. Ms. Brooks, may I ask one more question? Angela smiled warmly. Of course. Ethan placed the summary beside her handwritten notes. When you first realized these records did not make sense, what convinced you to continue looking instead of assuming someone else would notice? Angela reflected quietly before answering. Because every spreadsheet eventually became the story of a real family. Numbers may appear on paper, but behind every delayed payment was someone trying to pay rent, buy groceries, or keep the lights on. Once I understood that, ignoring the inconsistencies no longer felt like an option. Her answer caused several nearby investigators to pause their work for a brief moment. Laura looked toward Angela with genuine admiration. That perspective is something every investigator should remember. Cases are never only about documents. They are always about people. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that is why you discovered what we missed. You were reading every page with compassion as well as accuracy. Angela smiled modestly. Compassion simply encouraged me to keep reading. At that moment, the forensic accounting supervisor approached carrying a printed verification report. Laura, we have completed independent confirmation of every transaction Ms. Brooks identified this morning. Laura accepted the report and reviewed several pages before announcing the results to the room. Every financial pathway has now been independently verified by 3 separate review teams. There are no unexplained discrepancies remaining in her documentation. A quiet sense of accomplishment spread through the conference room. No applause followed. Experienced professionals understood that evidence deserved careful respect rather than celebration. Laura walked toward Angela and extended her hand once again. On behalf of everyone involved in this investigation, thank you for refusing to overlook what others considered insignificant. Angela shook her hand gently. I only hope the families affected eventually receive the help they were promised. Laura answered with complete sincerity. Today brings us much closer to making that possible. As the meeting began concluding, Ethan accompanied Angela toward the hallway outside Conference Room 6. The secure corridor felt noticeably different from when they had first stepped off the elevator earlier that morning. Investigators passing through the hallway greeted Angela respectfully by name. Administrative employees smiled warmly. Several analysts thanked her for the clarity she had brought to months of difficult work. None of those gestures felt forced. They reflected genuine appreciation earned through honesty, preparation, and perseverance. As they reached the elevator, Ethan looked toward Angela. This morning someone questioned whether you belonged inside this building. Angela glanced briefly toward the closed conference room doors before answering. People sometimes confuse belonging with appearances. Ethan smiled. Not anymore. The elevator doors quietly opened before them. As they stepped inside, neither realized that the lessons learned throughout the day would soon extend far beyond one successful investigation, influencing how an entire federal office viewed both evidence and the people brave enough to bring it forward. The elevator descended quietly toward the main lobby, carrying Detective Ethan Walker and Angela Brooks through the final moments of a day that had already changed far more than either of them expected. Neither spoke during the short ride. They simply watched the floor numbers illuminate one after another while reflecting on how differently the morning had begun. When the doors finally opened, the atmosphere downstairs felt noticeably warmer than it had only a few hours earlier. The reception area remained busy with attorneys, investigators, visitors, and administrative employees moving between security checkpoints and elevators, yet something subtle had changed. Conversations sounded friendlier. Greetings appeared more genuine. People looked at one another instead of through one another. Richard Hale noticed them almost immediately. He stepped away from the security desk before either of them reached the entrance. His posture reflected neither fear nor obligation. Instead, it revealed someone who had spent the afternoon thinking carefully about the choices he had made. Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully, before you leave, may I thank you for accepting my apology earlier. Angela smiled kindly. The apology mattered because it was sincere. Richard nodded thoughtfully. After you went upstairs, I reviewed every visitor interaction from this morning. I realized how easily routine can become assumption if nobody pays attention. Ethan listened quietly, saying nothing. He believed real growth became meaningful only when it emerged without being demanded. Richard continued. I also spoke with building management. Beginning next week, every security contractor assigned to this facility will receive updated visitor training focused on professional communication, verified procedures, and respectful first contact. Angela looked pleasantly surprised. That sounds like a worthwhile step. Richard answered honestly. It should have happened long before today. Nearby, the receptionist smiled as she overheard the conversation. We are also updating our welcome procedures so visitors receive clear guidance before unnecessary questions create confusion. Ethan finally spoke. Good systems protect both security and dignity. Neither one should ever require sacrificing the other. Richard nodded with quiet appreciation. Before anyone could continue, Laura Mitchell stepped out of a nearby elevator carrying a slim folder. "Detective Walker, Ms. Brooks, I am glad I caught you." She handed Angela a neatly organized envelope. "Inside is an official acknowledgement confirming your voluntary cooperation with today's investigation. It does not reveal confidential information, but it formally recognizes your assistance." Angela accepted the envelope with both hands. "Thank you. Although recognition was never my goal." Laura smiled warmly. "Perhaps not, but gratitude should never remain unspoken." She then turned toward Ethan. "Detective, headquarters approved your request to expand the financial review. Multiple regional offices will begin coordinating tomorrow morning." Ethan accepted the update with quiet satisfaction. "Then the investigation finally has the direction it needed." Laura nodded. "And it began because someone outside law enforcement refused to overlook small details." As Laura returned upstairs, several federal employees walking through the lobby greeted Angela with genuine respect. Earlier that morning, many of those same people had watched silently while unfair assumptions unfolded before them. Now their expressions reflected something entirely different. They had witnessed how quickly appearances could mislead and how powerfully facts could restore perspective. Ethan walked with Angela toward the revolving glass doors leading outside. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble floor, casting long golden reflections that softened the once tense lobby. Just before reaching the exit, Angela paused briefly. "Detective Walker," she said quietly, "thank you for asking one simple question this morning instead of accepting the easiest answer." Ethan smiled gently. "Good investigations begin with honest questions. Good people deserve the same." Angela nodded before stepping into the cool autumn air. Ethan remained inside for a moment, watching the doors slowly close behind her. He glanced once toward the reception desk where every new visitor was now being welcomed with noticeably greater care than before. Badge for 17 had never been about authority alone. It represented a responsibility to ensure that truth always arrived before judgment. And as Ethan turned toward the elevators to continue the investigation, he quietly hoped that lesson would remain inside that federal building long after everyone had forgotten the events of a single ordinary Monday. The following morning, the Federal Justice Center welcomed another steady stream of visitors as the city settled into its familiar weekday rhythm. Sunlight reflected across the polished marble floors, and the lobby that had witnessed quiet tension only one day earlier now reflected a different sense of purpose. New visitor guidance signs stood beside the reception desk. Security procedures had been reorganized for greater clarity, and every guest was greeted with the same calm professionalism before any assumptions had the opportunity to shape an interaction. Richard Hale stood at his assigned security station with renewed focus. The events of the previous day had become more than an uncomfortable memory. They had become a personal standard that influenced every conversation he now had with the public. When an elderly veteran approached carrying several folders without an appointment, Richard welcomed him with a respectful smile, patiently explained the registration process, and helped him locate the correct office without hesitation. A young mother arrived moments later with 2 children while attempting to organize identification documents and paperwork at the same time. Instead of becoming impatient, Richard stepped around the desk, offered clear directions, and ensured she understood each step before sending her toward the elevators. None of those visitors would ever know why the atmosphere inside the building felt different that morning, but every one of them benefited from lessons learned the previous day. Upstairs, Detective Ethan Walker entered Conference Room 6, where investigators had already resumed reviewing financial records connected to the expanding fraud investigation. Senior Special Investigator Laura Mitchell addressed the assembled team before the morning briefing officially began. "Before we review today's assignments, I want everyone to remember something important. Yesterday reminded us that valuable evidence does not always arrive wearing a government badge. Sometimes it arrives because an ordinary citizen chooses responsibility over convenience." Several investigators nodded in quiet agreement. Ethan recognized that Laura was speaking about more than one successful investigation. She was reinforcing the culture every public servant should protect. The briefing continued with updates from regional financial crime units, additional audit confirmations, and new requests for supporting documentation. Every report demonstrated that the investigation continued moving steadily forward because the original evidence had been carefully preserved instead of dismissed. During a short break, Ethan walked past the conference room window overlooking the city below. He thought about Angela Brooks returning to her community after quietly changing the direction of a federal case without ever seeking recognition. He also thought about the two careless words spoken in the lobby the previous morning. Those words had almost prevented the truth from reaching the people responsible for protecting it. The realization stayed with him because he understood how easily similar moments could happen again if professionals allowed assumptions to replace curiosity. Later that afternoon, Laura received confirmation that every regional office participating in the investigation had requested copies of the organizational methods Angela used while documenting financial irregularities. Rather than simply distributing evidence, they also wanted investigators to study the discipline behind her record-keeping. Laura smiled as she shared the update with Ethan. It appears her notebooks are becoming training material. Ethan nodded. That may become the most valuable outcome of this entire investigation. Laura agreed. Evidence solves cases. Good habits prevent future failures. Before leaving for the day, Ethan passed through the main lobby once more. He noticed Richard greeting each visitor with patience, listening before speaking, and verifying information before reaching conclusions. Nothing about the interaction appeared dramatic. There were no speeches, no public acknowledgments, and no reminders about what had happened the day before. There was simply quiet professionalism practiced one conversation at a time. Ethan realized that lasting justice rarely announced itself through grand moments. More often, it revealed itself through ordinary choices repeated consistently until respect became part of the culture itself. As he stepped outside into the cool Washington afternoon, he carried with him a renewed understanding that the strongest badge was never the one displayed on a jacket. It was the character that guided every decision long before anyone else was watching. Several weeks passed, and the investigation continued expanding with the same patience and discipline that had defined its turning point. Inside the Federal Justice Center, Conference Room 6 remained active from early morning until late evening as investigators, financial analysts, and legal specialists carefully assembled evidence supported entirely by documented facts. Every new discovery traced back to the organized records Angela Brooks had quietly carried into the building on that autumn morning. Detective Ethan Walker often reflected on how close the investigation had come to overlooking information that later proved essential. The thought remained with him because it reminded him that justice depended not only upon skill, but also upon the willingness to truly see the people standing in front of you. Senior Special Investigator Laura Mitchell entered the conference room, carrying the latest investigative summary. She placed the report on the table before addressing the team. Today marks another important milestone. Every regional office participating in this investigation has completed its independent verification. The evidence remains consistent across every jurisdiction. Quiet satisfaction spread throughout the room. Months of uncertainty had finally been replaced by confidence built upon careful work rather than speculation. Ethan reviewed the summary before looking toward Laura. How many additional agencies are now coordinating with us? Laura answered, 12 federal and state partners are sharing verified financial records under one investigative framework. That level of cooperation would not have been possible without the original documentation establishing credibility. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Strong evidence created trust, and trust allowed institutions to work together without unnecessary hesitation. Later that afternoon, Laura invited several newly assigned investigators into the conference room for an orientation briefing. Instead of beginning with technical procedures, she placed Angela's neatly organized notebooks on the center of the conference table. The room became quiet as everyone looked at the ordinary binders that had quietly transformed an entire investigation. Laura spoke with calm conviction. Before we discuss investigative software or financial analysis, I want you to understand why these notebooks matter. They remind us that careful observation, patience, and respect for facts remain the foundation of every successful investigation. One young investigator carefully raised a hand. Were these records prepared by another federal agent? Laura smiled gently. No, They were prepared by a citizen who refused to ignore details because she understood that every missing dollar affected someone's daily life. The room remained silent as the significance of those words settled over everyone present. Ethan noticed several investigators studying the notebooks with genuine respect rather than simple curiosity. They were beginning to understand that professionalism was not measured only by titles or credentials. It was measured by integrity, consistency, and the courage to continue searching when easier answers seemed available. That afternoon, Ethan walked through the main lobby on his way to another meeting. The familiar reception area had become noticeably different from the place it had once been. Visitors were welcomed with clear instructions and respectful conversations. Security officers verified information carefully before reaching conclusions. Employees greeted unfamiliar faces with patience instead of suspicion. Richard Hale noticed Ethan passing by and smiled. "Good afternoon, Detective." Ethan returned the greeting. "How have things been going?" Richard glanced around the lobby before answering. "Busy, but better. I have discovered that treating every visitor with respect actually makes security easier, not harder." Ethan smiled. "People usually respond well when they know they are being treated fairly." Richard nodded. "I wish I had understood that much sooner." As Ethan continued toward the elevators, he realized that no official memorandum alone could have created this cultural change. Policies mattered, training mattered, procedures mattered, but lasting improvement always began when individuals accepted responsibility for their own choices. Inside one federal building, ordinary conversations had become more thoughtful because one difficult lesson had been honestly accepted instead of quietly forgotten. As the elevator doors closed, Ethan looked briefly at the polished badge attached to his jacket. He understood more clearly than ever that its true purpose had never been to command respect. Its purpose was to earn trust by ensuring that every decision reflected fairness before authority, facts before assumptions, and humanity before judgment. Months later, the investigation that had once depended upon scattered questions had become one of the most respected examples of patient financial analysis within the federal system. Every conclusion rested upon verified records, disciplined cooperation, and the determination of people who refused to substitute assumptions for facts. Millions of dollars intended for community programs were successfully traced through documented financial pathways, allowing public agencies to strengthen oversight procedures and better protect future funding. For Detective Ethan Walker, however, the most meaningful result could never be measured by reports or statistics alone. The greatest victory had unfolded long before the investigation reached its official milestones. It had begun the moment someone chose to ask one fair question instead of accepting one unfair assumption. On a quiet afternoon near the end of the investigation, Ethan received permission to visit the neighborhood community center where Angela Brooks continued serving local families. The building looked ordinary from the outside, with children playing basketball in the nearby gymnasium and volunteers organizing donated books inside the entrance hall. Nothing about the place suggested national recognition or federal investigations. That simplicity reminded Ethan why Angela had noticed what others overlooked. She had always focused on people before paperwork. Angela welcomed him with the same calm smile she had carried into the Federal Justice Center months earlier. "Detective Walker," she said warmly, "it is good to see you again." Ethan shook her hand. "I wanted to thank you personally. The investigation reached another successful milestone this week." Angela nodded with quiet satisfaction. "I heard the agencies are improving how grant funding is monitored." Ethan smiled. "They are. Your careful records influenced more than one investigation. They also changed how several offices evaluate financial reports." Angela looked toward a classroom where volunteers were helping students finish their homework. "That matters more than anything else. If better systems prevent future families from losing support, then every hour spent reviewing those records was worthwhile." Ethan followed her gaze toward the children laughing together inside the classroom. At that moment, he fully understood why Angela had never asked for recognition. Her purpose had never been to receive credit. Her purpose had always been to protect people she might never even meet. Before leaving, Ethan handed her a framed letter signed by leaders from the participating investigative agencies. It expressed gratitude for her integrity, patience, and extraordinary commitment to public service. Angela accepted the frame quietly before reading only the final sentence aloud. Justice grows stronger whenever ordinary people choose honesty over silence. She smiled gently. I think my father would have liked those words. Ethan answered softly. His lessons reached much farther than either of you probably imagined. As he walked back toward his government vehicle, Ethan reflected on everything that had happened since that ordinary Monday morning. A pair of careless words had nearly closed the door on the truth. Instead, patience had opened it wider than anyone expected. Richard Hale had become a better public servant because he accepted responsibility instead of defending his mistakes. Laura Mitchell had strengthened investigative training by reminding every new investigator that evidence deserved respect regardless of who delivered it. Countless federal employees had learned that professionalism began with listening before judging. Most importantly, one woman's quiet determination had protected opportunities for families she would never know personally. The story had never truly belonged to a badge, a title, or an investigation. It belonged to the enduring truth that dignity cannot be measured by appearance, authority cannot replace character, and justice begins the moment someone decides to see another human being as worthy of fairness before forming an opinion. Long after reports were archived and meetings concluded, that lesson continued echoing through every hallway where facts were allowed to speak before assumptions, proving that the strongest form of justice is not the power to judge others, but the wisdom to recognize their humanity first.